I remember the exact moment the silence in our house shattered, and with it, the only life I had known for 5 years. They say you don't realize you're living in a glass house until the first stone is thrown. But looking back, I think I knew the cracks were forming long before the police sirens started wailing outside our driveway. My name is Maya, and at 24 years old, I've learned that the people you would take a bullet for are often the ones holding the gun. But this isn't just about me. It's about 2 little souls, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, who were once the center of my universe and who are now being taught to believe that I am a monster. How do you go from being the person who tucked them in every night, who wiped their tears and knew their favorite colors, to being a stranger who isn't even allowed to hear their voices over a phone? How does a mother decide that the very family who raised her children when she couldn't or wouldn't is suddenly a danger to them? The truth is, I've spent the last few months staring at a silent phone, waiting for a notification that never comes, and wondering if my niece and nephew even remember the sound of my voice. I find myself walking past the toy aisle in the grocery store, reaching for a specific brand of fruit snacks or a new action figure, before the crushing weight of reality hits me. I have nowhere to send them. I am a ghost in their lives, haunted by the memory of their laughter. But to understand how we got to this point of total isolation, you have to understand the dynamic of our home. You have to understand the headaches, the closed doors, and the secret life my brother's wife was living right under our noses. My brother, David, is 30. He's the kind of guy who works himself to the bone to provide. When he married Sarah, who is 25, we all wanted it to work. We wanted that picture-perfect family for him. And for a while, it seemed like they had it. They had 2 beautiful children, a son who is now 5 and a daughter who just turned 2. But the reality inside the house was far from the photos Sarah posted on social media. For as long as I can remember, Sarah was sick. It started small, but eventually, it became her identity. She would spend hours, sometimes entire days, locked in her bedroom. She claimed she had debilitating headaches, that she needed rest, that she couldn't handle the noise. And because we loved those kids, we stepped in. My parents and I didn't even think twice about it. If Sarah was in her room with the curtains drawn, I was the one making sure my nephew had his breakfast. I was the one teaching him his ABCs while his sister crawled around my feet. We took them to the park, we fed them, we bathed them, and we sat on the floor playing with blocks until our backs ached. We weren't just aunt and grandparents. We were their primary caregivers. We were the ones who saw every milestone, who heard every first word, while Sarah remained a shadow behind a closed bedroom door. At the time, I thought I was being a supportive sister. I thought I was helping a woman who was struggling with her health. I didn't realize I was actually enabling a double life. The tension started to build about a year ago. David wasn't stupid. He could feel Sarah slipping away, even when she was physically in the house. She was always on her phone, the screen's glow the only light in her darkened room. She became protective of it, jumping whenever it vibrated, taking it with her even when she just went to the bathroom. David tried to fix it. He's a fixer by nature. In their marriage, they had a history of adding people to their problems, bringing in friends or outsiders to mediate or distract from the core issues. But this time, Sarah wasn't looking for a mediator. She was looking for an exit. It all came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in the house felt heavy, like the atmosphere right before a summer storm. David had come home early, and something was different. He had found them, the messages. Sarah hadn't been sleeping off headaches. She had been talking to other men, multiple men. The betrayal wasn't just a single mistake, it was a catalogue of infidelity, documented in thousands of texts and photos. When David confronted her, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. I was in the kitchen when the shouting started. It was jarring because in our family, we didn't grow up with screaming matches. My parents always handled disagreements with quiet conversations or walks around the block. Hearing my brother's voice break with that kind of pain was like hearing a sound I didn't recognize. Sarah wasn't crying out of guilt. She was panicked because she had been caught. She started pleading with him, telling him they could work it out, just the two of them. She didn't want the rest of the family to know. She was terrified of her image being ruined, of being seen as anything other than the tired, sick mum she portrayed to the world. She began following David through the house, cornering him, trying to stop him from leaving the room or talking to anyone else. She was desperate to keep the secret contained within the four walls of their bedroom. I stood in the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs, paralyzed by the sudden eruption of chaos. And then I remembered the kids. They were right there. They were seeing their father's world fall apart and their mother's desperation turn into something ugly. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed both of them, my 5-year-old nephew looking at me with wide, confused eyes, and the 2-year-old clutching her blanket, and I hurried them into my bedroom. I turned on the TV, found a bright, loud cartoon, and sat on the floor with them. "It's okay," I whispered, though my own hands were shaking. "Daddy and Mummy are just having a loud talk. Let's watch this, okay?" I wanted to shield them. I wanted to be the barrier between their innocence and the toxicity that was currently tearing through the hallway. What happened next is a blur of motion and sound. I stayed in that room with the children, making sure they didn't hear the worst of it. I didn't see the physical struggle. I didn't see what transpired in those seconds of high-voltage emotion. All I know is that moments later, the house went eerily quiet, followed by the sound of Sarah's voice, not shouting at David anymore, but screaming into a phone. She was calling the police. She was telling them that he had put his hands on her. My stomach dropped. I looked at the kids, who were fortunately distracted by the flickering screen, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. I knew my brother. I knew he was hurting, and I knew he was angry. But I also knew his heart. Yet, in that moment, it didn't matter what I knew. The wheels were already in motion. When the police arrived, the atmosphere shifted from a private tragedy to a public crime scene. They took David away in handcuffs. I watched from the window, still holding my niece, as my brother was led to a patrol car, his head bowed, his entire life dismantled in the span of 30 minutes. Sarah didn't look at me. She didn't look at the kids. She waited for the police to leave, and then she walked out to her car. She sat there for 3 hours, just sitting in the driveway, staring at nothing. I stayed inside with the children, feeding them dinner, giving them a bath, trying to maintain some semblance of a normal routine while the world outside was burning. I kept waiting for her to come in and check on them, to be a mother in the wake of the storm. But she didn't. It wasn't until late that night that there was a knock on my bedroom door. It was Sarah. She looked cold, distant, like she had already checked out of this life and was moving on to the next. "I'm taking the kids," she said. "No thank you for watching them. No explanation of what was going to happen to David. Just a cold command." I watched them go, thinking it was just for the night. I thought we would talk in the morning. I thought that once the dust settled, we would figure out how to navigate this mess for the sake of the children. I went to work the next morning with a heavy heart, but I convinced myself that things would stabilize. But when I pulled into the driveway that evening, the house felt empty. Not just quiet empty, but abandoned empty. Sarah was gone. She had packed up the kids and whatever else she could fit into her car and vanished. No one got to say goodbye. Not my parents, not me. One day we were a family, and the next, the people who had been the center of our lives for 5 years were simply erased. The silence that followed Sarah's departure wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears, a constant reminder of what's missing. For 5 years, our home had been a symphony of chaotic joy. The thumping of small feet on the floorboards, the high-pitched giggles over a cartoon, the specific clinking sound of plastic blocks being dumped out of a bin. All of it was gone. In its place was a hollow, echoing stillness that made every room feel 5 times larger than it actually was. I remember walking into the living room that first morning after she left. I saw a single, half-eaten graham cracker sitting on the coffee table, right next to a stray blue crayon. My heart didn't just ache. It felt like it was being physically crushed. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. To throw them away was to admit they weren't coming back for snack time. To clean up was to erase the last physical evidence that they had been there at all. My parents were even worse. My mother, a woman who had spent the last 5 years making sure those kids were fed and bathed and loved, looked like she had aged 10 years overnight. She would sit in the kitchen, staring at the empty high chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a cold cup of coffee. The legal storm hit us before we even had a chance to process the emotional one. Because of the domestic violence call Sarah had made, the system kicked into high gear. Now, I wasn't in the room when whatever happened between her and David went down. I didn't see a struggle. I didn't hear a blow. All I heard was her screaming into the phone after the argument had already peaked. But in the eyes of the law, a phone call is a powerful weapon. David was suddenly a threat, a man who needed to be kept away from his own children. Watching my brother navigate those first few weeks was like watching a man drown in shallow water. He was devastated by the loss of his marriage, yes, but that paled in comparison to the agony of being separated from his kids. He would sit in his room, scrolling through photos of them on his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light, looking for any sign that they were okay. He reached out to Sarah constantly, pleading for just a 5-minute FaceTime call, just to hear them say "Daddy." The response was always the same. Silence. Or, worse, a cold, calculated text from her lawyer. Then came the first court hearing. I remember the air in that courthouse. It smelled like floor wax and despair. Sarah sat on the opposite side of the room, looking polished and composed. Gone was the woman who spent all day in a dark room with a headache. She looked like a warrior mum, someone who was protecting her children from a dangerous environment. It was a performance that turned my stomach. She stood before a judge and painted a picture of our home that I didn't recognize. She described us not as the family who had essentially raised her children while she slept, but as a toxic, enabling environment that she had finally escaped. The judge, as judges often do in these high-conflict cases, played it safe. He ordered supervised visitation for David. It was a gut punch, but we told ourselves it was a start. It was a foot in the door. We thought, okay, if David has to be supervised, we can still be there. We can still see them. We were the village that had raised them. Surely the court would see that our relationship with the children was separate from the drama between the parents. We were wrong. When my parents and I reached out to Sarah, asking, begging to see the kids, she didn't just say no. She weaponized her refusal. She told us that because we were David's family, we were a part of the problem. She claimed that seeing us would be confusing for the children. Think about that for a second. These children had spent every single day of their lives with us. I was the one who taught my nephew how to ride a tricycle. My mother was the one who rocked my niece to sleep every night when she was a baby. We weren't just relatives. We were their primary source of stability. And now, according to Sarah, we were suddenly a psychological hazard. The irony was sickening. Sarah, who had spent years being too sick to handle the day-to-day responsibilities of motherhood, was now the sole gatekeeper. She was the one who decided who got to love those children and who didn't, and she chose to use that power to cut us out entirely. My parents were eventually granted supervised visits, but even those were a nightmare. They had to go to a sterile, cold facility. a place with linoleum floors and security cameras, just to play with their grandchildren for an hour. Sarah wouldn't even look at them during the handoffs. She would drop the kids off like they were packages being delivered to a warehouse and then vanish. But for me, there was nothing. No supervised visits, no phone calls, nothing. Because I wasn't a parent or a grandparent, I had no legal standing in the eyes of the court. In the state's view, I was just an aunt, a third party, an optional extra. It didn't matter that I'd been a second mother to those kids. It didn't matter that my nephew's first word had been my name. The law doesn't have a category for the person who did all the work. It only cares about biological titles and legal paperwork. The hardest part wasn't just the absence. It was the psychological warfare Sarah started to wage through the children. My brother eventually graduated to unsupervised visits, as the court realized he wasn't the monster Sarah had tried to portray. But those visits became a battlefield of a different kind. One Saturday, David came home from a visit, looking like he had seen a ghost. He sat down at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. "What happened?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Are they okay?" David looked up and I saw tears in his eyes. "My son asked me something today," he whispered. "We were at the park, just playing, and he stopped and looked at me. He asked, 'Daddy, are you and Auntie Maya mean people?'" I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" He said Mummy told him that we weren't safe anymore. David continued, his voice shaking. "He asked why we didn't want to see him. He thinks we left him." That was the moment I realized the depth of the cruelty we were dealing with. It wasn't enough for Sarah to keep them away from us. She had to poison their memories of us. She was rewriting history in their little minds. She was taking the 5 years of love, of snacks, of bedtime stories, and of safety that we had provided, and she was painting it over with a layer of fear and lies. She was telling a 5-year-old that the people who loved him most in the world were mean. How do you fight that? How do you defend yourself against a lie being told to a child who doesn't have the capacity to understand adult spite? You can't. If you try to correct the child, you're accused of parental alienation. If you say nothing, the lie becomes their truth. We were trapped in a cage of her making, watching through the bars as she slowly erased our existence from their hearts. I started checking her social media, a habit I knew was toxic, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see them. I needed to see that they were still growing, still smiling, still alive. And there they were. Sarah was posting photos daily, photos of them at the zoo, photos of them eating ice cream, photos of them with new friends. In every caption, she wrote about her new beginning and how blessed she was to have such a peaceful life. It was a slap in the face. The peace she was bragging about was built on the wreckage of our family. The new beginning was only possible because she had burned the old world down and barred the gates. I would stare at those photos, zooming in on my nephew's face, looking for any sign of the boy I knew. Did he look thinner? Did he look sad? Or, and this was the thought that hurt the most, did he look happy? Was he actually doing fine without us? Had he already forgotten the sound of my laugh? I began to realize that Sarah's headaches from the past weren't just a physical ailment. They were a symptom of her inability to handle reality. When things got hard, she checked out. When she got caught in her lies, she didn't apologize. She went on the offensive. She was a master of the pivot. She had pivoted from being the unfaithful, absent wife to being the victimized, protective mother. And she was using our children as the ultimate shields. Every holiday became a fresh wound. Christmas, birthdays, Easter, we still bought presents. My room was slowly filling up with toys that would never be played with, clothes that would be outgrown before they were ever worn. We would send them with David during his visits, but Sarah would often refuse to let the kids bring them home. She didn't want reminders of us in her space. So the toys would sit in David's car or in our living room, colourful reminders of a life that had been stolen. I found myself sitting on my bed one night, holding a stuffed dinosaur I had bought for my nephew's birthday. I remember the day I bought it. I had seen it in the window of a shop and thought, he's going to love this. He's going to make it roar and chase the cat. Now it was just a piece of fabric and stuffing sitting in a silent room. I realised then that I wasn't just grieving the loss of the children, I was grieving the loss of my own role in the world. I was an aunt with no one to aunt. I was a protector who had failed to protect the people who mattered most. But the worst part was the waiting. The agonising, slow-motion waiting for them to grow up. The hope that one day, when they were 18 or 20, they would realise the truth. But how many years of birthdays would we miss before then? How many milestones would pass in a blur of court dates and social media posts? The psychological warfare didn't just happen in the courtroom. It happened in the quietest moments of my day. Have you ever been gaslit by a photograph? Because that's what looking at Sarah's Instagram felt like. Every few days, a new photo would pop up. There they were, my kids, or at least they felt like mine, grinning at a pumpkin patch or wearing matching pajamas I didn't buy them. Sarah would write these long, poetic captions about healing and peace and protecting her peace. To the outside world, she was a hero, a woman who had pulled her children out of a dark situation and was now bathing them in light. But I knew the truth. I knew that the light she was talking about was actually a scorched earth policy that left everyone who actually cared for those kids in the ashes. It's a special kind of torture to watch someone rewrite your history in real time. I would sit on my porch at night, the same porch where I used to blow bubbles with my nephew until we both ran out of breath, and I'd scroll through her feed. I'd see a photo of my niece taking her first real steps, and my heart would shatter because I wasn't there to catch her. I wasn't the one cheering in the background. Instead, I was looking at a digital ghost of a milestone I should have been part of. I wanted to scream at the screen. I wanted to comment and say, "Where were you when she was teething and cried for 6 hours straight? Oh, that's right. You were in your room with a headache while I rocked her to sleep." But I couldn't. Anything I said, any move I made, would be used against David in court. I had to be a ghost so he could have a chance at being a father. That's the part people don't tell you about family court battles. It's not just the parents who are on trial. The entire support system is placed under a microscope. Sarah's lawyer had painted me as an unstable influence. Why? Because I was young? Because I lived at home? No, it was because I was a witness. I was the person who knew exactly how much she had neglected those children while we lived under the same roof. By cutting me out, she wasn't just hurting me. She was eliminating a witness to her own shortcomings. If I wasn't around, there was no one to remind the children or the court of the days she didn't get out of bed until 4 p.m. The first birthday after the split was my nephew's 5th. 5 years old. That's a big one. It's the age where they start to really remember things, where their personalities solidify. I spent weeks picking out the perfect gift. He was obsessed with space, so I found this incredible telescope and a set of glow-in-the-dark stars for his ceiling. I spent hours imagining us putting them up together, talking about the planets, watching his face light up. I wrapped it in bright blue paper with silver ribbons. I wrote a card that said, "To my favourite astronaut, I love you to the moon and back. Love, Auntie Maya." David took the gift with him to his scheduled visit. I waited by the door for him to come home, hoping for a video, a photo, anything to show me his reaction. When David pulled into the driveway, he didn't even get out of the car for a long time. I walked out to meet him, and I saw the blue package sitting in the back seat. It was still wrapped. The silver ribbon was slightly frayed, but the paper hadn't been touched. "She wouldn't let him have it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David shook his head, staring straight through the windshield. "She said it was too much." She said she didn't want him getting attached to things from people he doesn't see. She told him the gift was broken and had to stay in the car. I felt a physical pain in my chest, like someone had reached in and squeezed my heart. She told a 5-year-old his birthday present was broken, just so he wouldn't have a piece of me in his new life. That was the level of spite we were dealing with. It wasn't about the telescope. It was about erasing the connection. It was about making sure that every time he thought of me, it was associated with something broken or missing. I took the telescope back to my room and put it in the corner. I couldn't bring myself to return it. It felt like returning a piece of him. So it sat there, a silent, silver monument to a birthday party I wasn't invited to. My room began to look like a toy store warehouse. Stacks of board games, outfits for the 2-year-old that I knew would be too small by the time she saw them, a dollhouse that stayed half assembled on the floor. Every time I looked at those things, I felt like a failure. I was their aunt. I was supposed to be the fun one, the one who spoiled them, the one they ran to when they wanted a cookie before dinner. Now, I was just a name they weren't allowed to say. The impact on my parents was even more devastating. My mother is the heart of our family. She's the kind of woman who expresses love through food and constant hovering care. When the kids were living with us, her kitchen was a constant hum of activity. Now, she cooked for 2 people and spent the rest of her time cleaning a house that was already spotless. There were no toys to pick up, no sticky fingerprints to wipe off the glass doors. The cleanliness was depressing. It felt like a museum of a life that had ended. When my parents were finally granted their supervised visits at the facility, I thought it would bring them some peace. But watching them get ready for those visits was like watching people prepare for a funeral. They had to pack a bag with specific items allowed by the center. No outside food, no certain types of toys. They were treated like criminals visiting an inmate. They would come back exhausted, their eyes red from crying. "They asked about you today, Maya," my mum told me one evening, her voice trembling. "The little one, she kept looking at the door. She called the supervisor Auntie. She's forgetting what you look like." That hit me harder than anything Sarah had done directly. My niece, the baby I had held in the hospital hours after she was born, the girl who used to fall asleep with her tiny hand curled around my thumb, was starting to replace me. Her brain was doing what a 2-year-old's brain does. It was filling in the gaps. If Auntie Maya wasn't there, the title of Auntie moved to the next available person. I was being overwritten by a state-appointed supervisor in a grey polo shirt. I started to have dreams about them. In the dreams, we were back in the backyard. The sun was out, the sprinkler was running, and we were all laughing. But then Sarah would appear at the edge of the yard, and she would start pulling the children away. They would reach for me crying, but their voices would be muted, like they were behind thick glass. I would try to run to them, but my feet were stuck in the mud. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight. I found myself becoming bitter. I looked at other families in public, moms and aunts laughing together at the park, grandpas pushing strollers, and I felt a hot, bubbling resentment. Why them, I'd think? Why do they get the normal life? What did I do to deserve being exiled from my own family? I had never been a mean person. I had never been unsafe. My only crime was being David's sister and seeing Sarah for who she really was. David, to his credit, never stopped fighting. He spent every cent he had on lawyers. He documented every no, every missed phone call, every weird comment the kids made. But the legal system is a slow, grinding machine. It doesn't care about missed moments. It doesn't care about the emotional trauma of an aunt who can't say hello. It only cares about the best interests of the child. And in many jurisdictions, that's interpreted as keep the status quo. If the children are stable with the mother, even if that stability is built on lies, the court is hesitant to shake things up. The most painful realization was that Sarah was winning. Not because she was a better parent, but because she was willing to do things we weren't. She was willing to use the children as pawns. She was willing to lie. We were trying to play by the rules of love and logic, but Sarah was playing a game where the only rule was total victory. She didn't want a co-parenting relationship. She wanted a world where David and his family didn't exist, where she could be the center of the children's universe without anyone to challenge her narrative. I remember one specific night, about 6 months into this nightmare. I was sitting in the kitchen with David. We were both exhausted. He had just come back from a mediation session that had gone nowhere. "Do you think they'll ever know?" I asked him. "Do you think they'll ever realize we didn't just walk away?" David looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than sadness in his eyes. It was resolve. "I have to believe they will, Maya. They have our blood. They have the memories of how we treated them, even if those memories are buried deep right now. You can't erase 5 years of unconditional love with 6 months of lies. It doesn't work like that." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But then I thought about that 5-year-old boy asking if I was a mean person. And I wondered how much damage could be done in the years we had left to wait. How many more layers of lies would Sarah wrap around them before they were old enough to ask their own questions? The legal system is a cold, sterile machine that doesn't have a category for the aunt who did everything. As the months turned into a year, I learned the bitter reality of my standing, or lack thereof. In the eyes of the law, I was a legal ghost. I had no right to mediation, no right to a court-ordered visitation schedule, and no right to even demand a phone call. I was a third party, a collateral casualty in a war I didn't start, but was forced to fight from the sidelines. I remember sitting in my lawyer's office, well, David's lawyer, since I didn't even have a reason to have my own. I asked him point blank, "Is there anything I can do? Can I file for auntie rights?" The lawyer, a man who had seen 1,000 families tear each other apart, looked at me with a mix of pity and exhaustion. "Maya," he said softly, "unless you can prove that the mother is unfit to the point of endangerment, or that the children are being physically harmed, the court is going to defer to her. She is the custodial parent. If she says you're not allowed in their lives, the law backs her up. It's the parental liberty doctrine. She has the right to decide who her children associate with, even if it's based on lies?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Even if she's doing it just to hurt us?" "The court doesn't care about hurt," he replied. "They care about the status quo. And right now, the status quo is that she's the primary caregiver and you're a memory." A memory. That word haunted me. How do you fight being a memory? You can't argue with a shadow. You can't cross-examine a void. I went home that day and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, looking at the house. This was the house where my nephew learned to walk. This was the house where we had a tea party every Sunday afternoon with mismatched plastic cups and lukewarm tap water. Now, it was just a building full of adults who were grieving people who were still alive. The holiday season was the hardest. That first Christmas without them felt like a funeral that lasted for 6 weeks. In our family, Christmas was always a massive production. We'd decorate the tree together. The kids always got the bottom branches, which meant all the ornaments were clustered in one chaotic, glittery pile at the base. My mum would bake dozens of cookies, and the kitchen would smell like cinnamon and sugar for a month. That year, the boxes of decorations stayed in the attic. My mum didn't have the heart to bring them down. "What's the point?" she whispered when I asked. "The house is too quiet for a tree." We still bought gifts, of course. It's a sickness, really, this hope that refuses to die. I bought my niece a beautiful winter coat with faux fur trim and a matching hat. I bought my nephew a remote-controlled dinosaur that roared and moved its tail. We packed them all into David's car for his scheduled Christmas Eve visit. David came back 2 hours later. The gifts were still in the trunk. "She wouldn't even let me bring them inside the house," David said, his face pale. She told me through the Ring doorbell that she already had enough for them and that our clatter wasn't welcome. I didn't even get to see them. She said they were napping and she didn't want to wake them. It was Christmas Eve. Who makes a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old nap through their father's visit on Christmas Eve? Someone who wants to erase that father. Someone who wants those children to wake up on Christmas morning and think that only one side of their family cared enough to give them anything. I went to my room and cried until I felt hollow. I looked at the photos of previous Christmases, the ones Sarah hadn't deleted from her public profile yet. There was a photo of me and my nephew from 2 years ago. We were both covered in flour from making Santa's cookies. He was laughing, his face a mess of white powder, and I was kissing the top of his head. I looked at that girl in the photo, the younger version of me, and I envied her. She had no idea that her world was about to be stolen. She didn't know that the woman taking the picture was already planning her exit. That was the year I started digital stalking as a form of self-harm. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't stop. I found a way to view Sarah's stories without her knowing. I saw the new Christmas. She had a massive, perfectly decorated tree. Nothing like the lopsided one we used to have. She posted videos of the kids opening presents from Santa and from her new boyfriend, a man they had only known for a few months. Seeing another man in the place where my brother should have been was a different kind of pain. This stranger was holding my niece. He was helping my nephew assemble his toys. He was being given the dad experience that David was being denied. And the kids? They looked happy. That was the knife in the ribs. They didn't look like they were mourning us. They didn't look like they were missing their Auntie Maya. They looked like they were having the best day of their lives. I realized then that Sarah wasn't just keeping them away. She was replacing us. She was building a new family unit and slotting new people into our roles. It was like a play where the actors had been fired and replaced mid-performance, but the audience, the children, didn't know any better. They just kept watching the show. I started to pull away from my friends. They didn't understand. They'd say things like, "At least you don't have to deal with the diapers anymore." Or, "Think of all the free time you have." They meant well, but it felt like they were making light of a kidnapping. I didn't want free time. I wanted the chaos. I wanted the sticky handprints. I wanted the 6 a.m. wake-up calls. My identity had been so intertwined with being their aunt that without them, I didn't know who I was. I'd go to the grocery store and see a certain brand of yogurt, the one my nephew liked, the one with the little sprinkles in the lid, and I'd have to leave the aisle because I'd start shaking. I'd see a little girl in a pink tutu, and I'd have to look away because it reminded me of my niece's dance class that I was no longer allowed to attend. The world was a minefield of triggers. My brother and I became closer during this time, but it was a bond forged in trauma. We spent hours talking about the what-ifs. What if David hadn't looked at her phone? What if I had walked into the room when they were arguing? What if we had moved out sooner? But the what-ifs are a trap. They lead you down a dark hole where you end up blaming yourself for someone else's malice. David started to change too. He went from being a jovial, easygoing guy to someone who was constantly on edge. Every text notification made him jump. Every email from his lawyer sent him into a spiral of anxiety. He was living his life in 15-minute increments, the length of a supervised phone call that Sarah would often forget to answer. One night, David came into my room. He looked older than 30. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. "I saw them today," he said. It wasn't a supervised visit. He had seen them by chance. He had been driving past a park near Sarah's new apartment and spotted them. "Did you talk to them?" I asked, my heart racing. "I couldn't," he whispered. "I just sat in the car and watched from across the street. Maya, she's changed his hair. She cut it all off. You know how he loved his long curls? It's gone. He looks like a different kid. It's the small things that hurt the most. The hair, the clothes, the way they walked. Sarah was systematically erasing every trace of the children we knew. She was molding them into something else, something that belonged only to her. "Did they see you?" I asked. "My son looked toward the car," David said, a tear finally rolling down his cheek. For a second, I thought he recognized the car. He stopped playing and just stared. But then Sarah called him, and he turned around and ran to her. He didn't even look back. That image stayed with me. My nephew, standing in a park, staring at a car that held his father, and then turning away. It felt like a metaphor for our entire lives. We were right there, just across the street, watching, loving, hurting. But to them, we were just a parked car. We were a background detail in a life that was moving on without us. I started to realize that this wasn't going to be a short battle. This wasn't something that would be fixed by one good court date or one heartfelt letter. This was a marathon of endurance. I had to find a way to survive the middle years, those long, empty years between now and when the children would be old enough to seek out the truth for themselves. But how do you stay sane when you're mourning someone who isn't dead? How do you keep your heart open when every time you try to reach out, it gets slammed in a door? I started writing letters. I bought a leather-bound journal and I started writing to them. "Dear Leo," I wrote, "today was your 6th birthday. I bought you that telescope. It's sitting in my closet waiting for you. I want you to know that I didn't forget. I want you to know that I didn't stop loving you. If you're reading this years from now, please know that we never stopped fighting to see you." It was a small act of defiance. Sarah could control the present, but I refused to let her control the future. I was building a paper trail of love. I was documenting the truth so that one day, if they ever had questions, I would have the answers ready. The months turned into a year, and that year felt like a decade of slow-motion mourning. You ever have those moments where you're driving and for a split second you forget everything that's happened? You see a playground out of the corner of your eye and your brain automatically thinks, "Oh, Leo would love that slide." Or, "I should bring the baby here on Saturday." And then, a heartbeat later, the reality crashes back down on you like a physical weight, knocking the wind out of your lungs. You remember that you don't have a Saturday with them. You don't have a slide. You don't even have a phone number that hasn't been blocked. By the time the second year rolled around, the legal victory we had been praying for arrived, but it felt like a hollow one. David was finally granted unsupervised visitation every other weekend. On paper, it was a win. In reality, it was a fresh hell. Because while David could see them, I still couldn't. Sarah had made it a point in the legal mediation to specify that the children were not to be brought to our family home during David's time. She claimed the environment was emotionally charged and unstable. So, David had to pick them up and take them to a park, a mall, or a hotel. He couldn't bring them to the house where their toys were still waiting. He couldn't bring them to see their grandparents. I would stand at the window every other Friday, watching David drive away to go pick them up, and my heart would just break for him. And for me. I was 25 now, and I felt like I was living in a house of ghosts. My parents had stopped asking to see the kids. It was too painful to be told no 1,000 times, and the supervised visits at the facility had become so stressful that my father's blood pressure had skyrocketed. They had retreated into a kind of quiet, dignified grief, but I couldn't do that. I was still young, still angry, and still hopelessly attached. I started the long game. I knew that Sarah was counting on us giving up. She wanted us to fade away so she could tell the kids we just stopped caring. I refused to let that happen. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Tuesday when I saw something they'd like, I bought it. I'd wrap it up, write a long letter, and put it in a box in the back of my closet. I called it The legacy box. It was my insurance policy against the lies she was telling them. David would come home from those unsupervised visits looking like he'd been through a war. The kids were older now, 5.5 and nearly 3. They were starting to form their own opinions, but those opinions were being shaped by a master manipulator. They asked about the mean house again, David told me one Sunday night after dropping them off. He was sitting on the floor of the living room, leaning against the sofa, looking completely defeated. The mean house? I asked. Is that what she's calling our home? David nodded. She told them that this house is where people go to be sad and angry. She told them that Auntie Maya and Grandma and Grandpa are resting and don't want to be disturbed. Leo asked me if you were still sleeping. He thinks you've been in bed for 2 years. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. The irony was almost too much to bear. Sarah, the woman who spent half of her marriage in a darkened room with headaches, was telling the children that we were the ones who were absent and unavailable. She was projecting her own failures onto us, and because they were children, they believed her. To them, we weren't the people who raised them. We were the people who had checked out. I started to notice a pattern in the photo Sarah posted online. She was no longer just the warrior mum. She was now the perfect partner. She had a new boyfriend, a guy named Mark, who seemed to be in every single shot. There was Mark teaching Leo how to throw a baseball, something David had been asking to do for months. There was Mark holding my niece at the zoo. The captions were always things like, "Finally, a real man in their lives," or "So grateful for the peace and stability Mark brings to our home." It was a performance for an audience of one, us. She knew we were watching. She knew that every photo of Mark doing dad things was a needle in David's heart. And she knew that every photo of the kids looking happy with a stranger was a slap in the face to the aunt and grandparents who had actually done the work. I remember one Saturday, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew David was with the kids at a local park. I didn't want to cause a scene, and I didn't want to violate any rules, but I just needed to see them with my own eyes. Not through a screen, not in a pixelated photo. I needed to know they were real. I drove to the park and sat in my car, parked way at the back of the lot. I had binoculars, a gift for Leo that I had never been able to give him. I felt like a criminal, a stalker in my own family's life. But when I spotted them near the swings, everything else disappeared. Leo had grown so much. He was wearing a bright red sweatshirt and he was running in circles around the swing set, laughing. My niece was in a stroller, kicking her little legs, her hair tied up in 2 messy pigtails. David was standing there, pushing the swing, looking at them with an expression of such pure, desperate love that it hurt to watch. I stayed in the car for 20 minutes, just watching them exist. I saw Leo trip and fall, and for a split second, I almost opened the car door to run to him. I could almost feel the weight of him in my arms, the smell of his shampoo, the way he'd wipe his nose on his sleeve. But I stayed put. I watched David pick him up, brush off his knees and kiss the top of his head. As I sat there, I realised something terrifying. Leo didn't look toward the parking lot. He didn't look like a child who was missing someone. He looked like a child who was perfectly content in his new, smaller world. To him, the Auntie Maya who used to build fortresses out of blankets and make the best grilled cheese sandwiches was just a fading dream. I was a character from a storybook he hadn't read in a long time. That realization changed me. I stopped being the grieving aunt and started being the patient aunt. I realized that I couldn't fight Sarah's lies with words because I wasn't allowed to speak to the children. I couldn't fight them with presence because I wasn't allowed to be there. I could only fight them with time. I started focusing on my own life, not because I wanted to move on, but because I knew I had to be strong for when they finally came back. I went back to school, I got a better job, I worked out, I became the best version of myself, all while keeping that legacy box in the back of my closet. I told myself, one day Leo is going to walk through that door, One day, my niece is going to ask what really happened, and when that day comes, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to have the photos, the journals, and the gifts. I'm going to have the proof that we never, ever left them. But the waiting is a heavy burden. There are nights when the silence in the house is so loud that I have to leave. I'll go for long drives, playing the songs we used to sing in the car, crying until my eyes are swollen shut. I see the headaches Sarah used to have in a new light now. They weren't just physical. They were her way of avoiding the beautiful, messy, exhausting reality of being a parent. And now that she's successfully cut us out, she's realised that she has to be a parent 24/7. David told me that during the visits, the kids sometimes seem off. They're guarded. They'll start to say something about the old house, and then they'll stop themselves, looking over their shoulders as if Sarah is watching them. She's trained them to be silent about us. She's taught them that mentioning our names is a bad thing that makes Mummy sad. Can you imagine the psychological toll that takes on a child? To feel like your memories are a betrayal. To feel like loving your father's family is a sin against your mother. It's a form of abuse that doesn't leave bruises, but it scars the soul just as deeply. One day, David brought home a drawing Leo had made at school. It was a picture of a house. There were 4 people in the house: Leo, his sister Sarah, and Mark. David was drawn outside the house, standing on the grass. "Where's Auntie Maya?" David had asked him. Leo had looked at the drawing for a long time, then pointed to a small, faint circle in the sky. "She's the moon," he whispered. "She only comes out when it's dark." When David told me that, I didn't cry. I felt a strange sense of peace. If she's told him I'm the moon, then I'll be the moon. I'll be the constant light in the darkness. I'll be the thing that's always there even when he can't see me. I'll be the one watching over him from afar, waiting for the cycle to turn, waiting for the sun to go down so I can show him the way home. But the question remains, how long can a family survive on hope alone? My parents are getting older. The unsupervised visits for David are still restricted. Sarah is still posting her perfect life for the world to see. We are still the mean people in the story she tells her children. The 3-year mark is when a strange kind of numbness starts to set in. It's a survival mechanism, I think. Your heart can't stay at a breaking point forever. Eventually, it just hardens into a dull, constant ache that you carry around like a heavy coat. You get used to the weight. You learn how to walk with it, how to breathe around it. But then something happens. A smell, a song, a glimpse of a child's backpack, and the coat feels like it's made of lead again. By now, Leo was 6, almost 7. My niece, Lily, was nearly 4. She didn't even have memories of me anymore. To her, I was just a face in a photo that her mother probably hid in a shoebox at the back of a closet. David was still getting his bi-weekly visits, but the restrictions Sarah placed on them were like a chokehold. He had to pick them up from a neutral location, usually a McDonald's parking lot, and he wasn't allowed to bring them to our street. He was essentially a nomadic father, living out of his car and public parks for 48 hours every other weekend. One Friday afternoon, David came home before his pickup, and I saw him sitting at the kitchen table staring at a piece of paper. It was a flyer for Leo's school play. Leo had mentioned it during a phone call, and David had looked it up online. "I'm going," David said, his voice flat but determined. "It's a public event. She can't stop me from being in a school auditorium." My heart leaped. "Can I go? David, please, I'll sit in the back. I'll wear a hat and glasses. She won't even know I'm there. I just want to see him perform. I just want to see him be a kid." David looked at me, and I saw the conflict in his eyes. He knew that if Sarah saw me, she'd make a scene. She'd use it as proof that we were stalking her, that we were violating her boundaries. But he also knew how much I was starving for just a glimpse of them. "Fine," he whispered, "but we go separately. We don't sit together, and the moment it's over, you leave. Don't try to talk to them. Don't let them see you." The night of the play, I felt like a spy in my own town. I parked 3 blocks away from the school and walked through the chilly evening air, my heart hammering against my ribs. The school hallway smelled exactly how I remembered: waxed floors, construction paper, and that faint scent of cafeteria food. I found a seat in the very last row of the auditorium, tucked into a corner near the exit. I scanned the crowd, and there they were. Sarah was sitting in the 3rd row, right in the centre. She looked radiant, her hair perfectly styled, laughing with another woman. And next to her was Mark. He was holding Lily on his lap. My niece was wearing a little velvet dress, her hair in a perfect bow. Seeing her so close yet a world away felt like being electrocuted. I wanted to scream her name. I wanted to run down that aisle and pull her into my arms and tell her that I was the one who used to change her diapers and sing her to sleep. But I sat perfectly still, my knuckles white as I gripped my purse. Then the curtains opened. It was a simple play about the solar system. And there was Leo. He was dressed as Mars, wearing a round red costume that looked slightly too big for him. He looked so much like David at that age, it was haunting. He stood on that stage, reciting his 2 lines with a serious, focused expression. I started to cry. Not a loud, sobbing cry, but the kind where the tears just leak out of your eyes and you can't stop them. I was so proud of him. My little astronaut, finally getting his moment in the stars. I watched him scan the audience looking for his mum. He found her, and he gave a tiny, shy wave. Then his eyes drifted further back. For 1 split second, I swear he looked right at me. I froze. I stopped breathing. Did he recognize me? Did he see the girl who used to play Space Mission with him in the backyard? His gaze lingered for a heartbeat too long, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. And then he looked away, back to his teacher. The play ended, and the auditorium erupted in applause. I stood up immediately, following David's instructions. I didn't wait for the meet and greet. I didn't wait to see Sarah's smug face or Mark playing the role of the doting father. I hurried out into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I sat in my car and just shook. I had seen them. They were real. They were growing. They were okay, but they weren't mine anymore. When David got home later that night, he was vibrating with a different kind of energy. He had stayed. He had gone up to Leo after the play. She tried to block me, David said, pacing the living room. She literally stepped in front of him when she saw me approaching. But Leo saw me. He yelled, "Daddy!" and ran past her. He hugged me so hard I thought he'd never let go. Did he say anything about seeing someone else? I asked, my voice trembling. David paused. He looked at me, his expression softening. He asked me why the moon girl was crying. I felt the air leave my lungs. The moon girl? He told me he saw a girl in the back who looked like the moon, David whispered. He said she looked sad. Maya, he remembers. He might not have the words, he might not have the context, but his soul knows you. Sarah can't erase that. She can change his hair, she can change his house, she can give him a new dad, but she can't reprogram his heart. That was the first time in 3 years I felt a genuine spark of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that made everything better, but it was the kind that gave me the strength to keep going. If I was the moon girl to him, this distant, glowing presence that appeared in the dark, then I would accept that title. I would be the light that watched over him, even if he didn't quite understand why. But the reality of our exile continued to grind us down. My father's health began to fail. The stress of the legal battles and the heartbreak of being separated from his grandchildren took a physical toll. He had a minor stroke about 6 months after the school play. We tried to tell Sarah. We sent her a polite, formal email explaining that the kid's grandfather was in the hospital and that it would mean the world to him to see them, even if it was just for 10 minutes. Her response was a cold, 1-sentence reply from her lawyer. My client does not feel that exposing the children to a hospital environment or an ailing relative is in their best psychological interest at this time. I watched my father lie in that hospital bed, his speech slurred, his right side weak, asking for Leo. And I had to look him in the eye and lie. I had to tell him that they were busy with school, that they sent their love, that they'd see him soon. I saw the light go out of my father's eyes that day. He knew. He knew that the woman we had once welcomed into our home was now holding his grandchildren hostage while he was at his most vulnerable. It was during those hospital nights that I started to truly understand the depth of Sarah's headaches. They weren't just an excuse to avoid chores, they were her armor. Whenever life required her to be selfless, she developed a headache. Whenever someone else needed care, she became the one who needed care more. She was a black hole of need, and anyone who tried to fill that hole was eventually sucked dry and discarded. We were just the latest casualties. The anger I felt toward her began to transform into something sharper, clarity. I stopped wondering why she was doing this. She was doing it because she could. She was doing it because the system allowed a mother's spite to be masked as protection. She was doing it because it gave her a sense of power that she lacked in every other area of her life. I started to focus more on the legacy box. I didn't just put toys in it anymore. I put in copies of our family tree. I put in a thumb drive full of videos. Videos of Leo's first steps, of Lily's first laugh, of us all opening presents together. I wrote down the stories of their births, the things their father said when he first saw them, the way the house felt when they were in it. I was building a library of truth. I knew that one day the perfect life Sarah was building would start to crack. You can't build a foundation on lies and expect it to hold forever. Mark would eventually see the headaches. The kids would eventually start asking questions that Sarah couldn't answer. And when that happened, I wanted the truth to be waiting for them, preserved like a time capsule. But as I sat by my father's bed, listening to the beep of the heart monitor, I realized the cruelest part of this whole situation. We were losing time that we could never get back. My father might not be around when Leo turns 18. My mother might not be there for Lily's graduation. Sarah wasn't just stealing our present, she was stealing our nevers. The nevers are the things that hurt the most. The graduations we'll never attend. The weddings we'll never be invited to. The simple, quiet Sundays we'll never have again. One evening, after my father was discharged and we were back at the house, a package arrived at the door. It was addressed to David. Inside was a small, crumpled drawing. There was no return address, but we knew who it was from. It was a picture of a rocket ship, and inside the rocket ship were two people. One was a little boy, and the other was a girl with long hair and a crescent moon on her shirt. At the bottom, in shaky first-grade handwriting, it said, "We are going to find you." Leo had smuggled it out. Maybe he gave it to a friend at school to mail, or maybe he found a way to slip it into the mailbox himself. But he had sent us a signal. I held that piece of paper, and I finally felt like I could breathe. We were the moon people now, living in the shadows of their lives, but we weren't forgotten. The connection was still there, buzzing like a live wire under the surface of Sarah's perfect world. "What do we do?" I asked David, looking at the drawing. David took the paper and pinned it to the refrigerator, right where everyone could see it. "We wait, Maya. We keep the lights on. We keep the legacy box full. And we never, ever stop being the people he's looking for." That drawing, that tiny crumpled piece of paper with the rocket ship and the moon girl, became our North Star. It was the only thing that kept us sane during the long, silent stretches between David's visits. I kept it in a plastic sleeve in my nightstand, and every night before I went to sleep, I'd look at it. It was proof. It was a secret handshake from a 7-year-old who was being taught to forget us, but who was clearly fighting back in his own quiet way. It was a reminder that while Sarah could control their physical bodies, She couldn't yet conquer their minds. But as we moved into the 4th year of this exile, the perfect life Sarah had built started to show its first real cracks. I'm a firm believer that you can only play a character for so long before your true self starts to bleed through the costume. Sarah had spent years playing the victim/hero role, but that role requires a constant supply of sympathy and attention. And the thing about people like Sarah is that they eventually exhaust their audience. I noticed it first on social media. The posts with Mark started to dwindle. At first, it was just fewer photos. Then the captions changed from "my rock" and "our hero" to vague, inspirational quotes about walking alone and trusting the process. We knew that code. It meant the headaches had come back. It meant that Mark, whoever he was, had finally realized that he wasn't just joining a family. He was being recruited into a war, and he was expected to do all the heavy lifting while Sarah retreated to her darkened bedroom. David started seeing the effects during his visits. Leo and Lily would arrive for their weekends looking disheveled, their clothes unwashed, their moods erratic. Leo, now nearly 8, was becoming protective of his little sister in a way that broke my heart. He was acting more like a parent than a child. "He's quiet, Maya," David told me one Sunday evening. "He doesn't want to play as much. He just wants to sit near me. And Lily, she's having accidents again. She's 5 years old and she's regressing." It was the classic sign of a home in turmoil. Without our village to pick up the slack, Sarah was failing. She didn't have my mother to cook the meals. She didn't have me to do the laundry and play the games. She didn't have my father to fix the broken toys. She was alone with 2 high-energy children and a mounting pile of resentment. And instead of reaching out, instead of admitting she needed help, she doubled down on the isolation. She started cancelling David's visits at the last minute, claiming the kids were sick or that they had prior engagements. The legal fees were drowning us. David was working 60 hours a week just to keep his lawyer on retainer. Every time Sarah cancelled a visit, it meant another filing, another court date, another $3,000 down the drain. Our house, once a place of laughter and comfort, had become a war room. The dining table was covered in calendars, printouts of text messages and legal briefs. We were living in a state of constant, low-grade trauma, waiting for the next blow to fall. I remember one Saturday morning, I was at the local farmers market. It was a beautiful, crisp fall day, the kind of day where you want to believe the world is a good place. I was standing at a stall picking out some apples when I heard a voice that made my blood turn to ice. "Lily, stay close. Don't touch that." I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There she was, Sarah. She was standing about 20 feet away, looking stressed and disheveled. She wasn't the polished woman from the Instagram photos. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she had deep circles under her eyes. And there were the kids. Leo was taller, his face starting to lose its baby roundness. He was staring at a display of pumpkins with a vacant expression. And Lily, she was beautiful. She had my mother's eyes. She was wearing a little denim jacket that looked a size too small. I stood frozen. Every instinct in my body told me to run to them, to scoop Lily up and kiss her forehead, to tell Leo I was the moon girl and I was right here. But I knew the rules. If I approached them, Sarah would call the police. She'd use it as harassment. I had to stay invisible. I ducked behind a large display of hay bales, watching them through the gaps. I saw Leo look around the market, his eyes scanning the crowd with that same searching look he'd had at the school play. My heart ached so badly I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. "I'm right here, Leo. I'm right here." Then something happened. Lily dropped her stuffed animal, a small, raggedy rabbit, and it rolled toward the hay bales where I was hiding. She started to cry, a small, tired sound. Sarah didn't move. She didn't even look down. She just sighed and rubbed her temples. "Lily, stop it. I have a headache. Just pick it up." But the rabbit had rolled under the edge of a wooden crate, out of the 5-year-old's reach. Lily was reaching for it, her little hand trembling. Without thinking, I reached out from behind the hay bale. I pushed the rabbit with my fingertips, sliding it back toward her. Lily stopped crying. She looked at the rabbit. Then her eyes followed the movement back to the shadows of the hay. For 3 seconds we made eye contact. She didn't know who I was. To her, I was just a stranger in the shadows. But she didn't look afraid. She looked curious. She picked up the rabbit, hugged it to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." "Lily, come on," Sarah snapped, grabbing her hand and pulling her away. I watched them walk toward the parking lot, my hand still resting on the cold ground where the rabbit had been. I felt like I was dying. To be that close, to touch something they touched, and to remain a ghost. It was a special kind of purgatory. I went back to my car and sat there for an hour, sobbing. I realized then that Sarah wasn't just hurting us. She was raising children who thought the world was a cold, impatient place. She was raising them in the shadow of her headaches, teaching them that their needs were a burden. When I got home, I went straight to the legacy box. I pulled out the journal and wrote down everything. I wrote about the rabbit. I wrote about the way Lily said thank you. I wrote about the look in Leo's eyes. I wanted them to know that even when I was invisible, I was looking out for them. I was the one pushing the rabbit back into their reach. That encounter changed something in me. I stopped being afraid of Sarah. I realized that she was a small, broken person who was drowning in her own choices. Her power over us was purely legal, but her power over the children was starting to slip. You can't parent by default forever. Children grow up. They start to notice the inconsistencies. They start to wonder why their mean relatives are the ones who always send the best gifts, while their perfect mother can't even pick up a stuffed bunny. David's lawyer eventually managed to get a custody evaluation ordered. This was a huge step. It meant a court-appointed psychologist would interview everyone, David, Sarah, and the children. They would visit the homes. They would look past the social media posts and the headaches and see the reality of the situation. The evaluation took months. Sarah fought it every step of the way. She claimed the kids were too traumatized to speak to a stranger. She missed appointments. She forgot to bring the children to the evaluator's office. But the evaluator wasn't a judge. She was a professional who had seen it all before. And every time Sarah dodged an appointment, it was another red flag. During this time, my father's health continued to decline. He was home now, but he was bedridden. He spent his days looking at a digital photo frame we had set up for him, a loop of the kids from before the split. He didn't speak much anymore, but whenever a photo of Leo or Lily came on the screen, he'd reach out a trembling hand and touch the glass. "Soon, Dad," I'd tell him, though I didn't know if I was lying. Soon. One night, the evaluator came to our house. She spent hours talking to me and my parents. She walked through the rooms, looking at the legacy box, which I chose to show her, the stacks of unwrapped gifts and the photo albums. She saw the room we still kept for the kids, the beds made, the toys organised, the moon girl drawing pinned to the wall. She didn't say much, but as she was leaving, she looked at me and said, "You've kept a lot of love waiting in this house, Maya. We just want them to know we never left," I said. She nodded, her expression unreadable. I think they're starting to realise that. A month later, the report came back. It was 100 pages of clinical observations, but the conclusion was clear. Sarah was engaging in restrictive gatekeeping and parental alienation. The evaluator noted that the children showed signs of anxiety and that their relationship with their father's family had been unnecessarily and detrimentally severed. She recommended that David be granted expanded custody and, for the first time, she recommended that the paternal aunt and grandparents be allowed liberal contact. We sat in the living room and cried when David read the words out loud. It felt like the first breath of fresh air after being underwater for 4 years. It wasn't a final court order yet, but it was the strongest weapon we had ever had. But Sarah wasn't going to go down without a fight. The moment she got the report, she did something we never expected. She didn't just ignore it. She didn't just file an appeal. She took the children and she vanished. The silence of a missing person is different than the silence of a blocked number. When someone blocks you, the silence is a wall. When someone vanishes, the silence is a void. It's an empty space where your imagination builds the worst possible scenarios to fill the gap. It started on a Friday afternoon. David was supposed to pick up Leo and Lily at the usual neutral spot, the parking lot of a local library. He arrived 10 minutes early, as he always did, with snacks in the back seat and a new Lego set for Leo. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. He called Sarah's cell phone, straight to voicemail. He called her lawyer's office. They hadn't heard from her. Finally, he drove to her apartment. He found the complex quiet, the blinds in her unit drawn tight. He knocked, then pounded on the door. Nothing. A neighbour stuck their head out and told him they hadn't seen Sarah's car since early that morning. When David called me, his voice was a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was pure, unadulterated terror. Maya, they're gone. Everything is gone. We didn't wait. We called the police immediately, but because there was no official court order for full custody yet, only the evaluator's recommendation, the police were hesitant. "It's a civil matter, sir," the officer told David over the phone. "She's the primary custodian. She has the right to travel with her children." "Travel?" David screamed. "She's fleeing a court recommendation. She cleared out her apartment. This isn't a vacation. It's a kidnapping." The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and despair. We didn't sleep. We sat in the living room, the war room, surrounded by legal documents that now felt like useless scraps of paper. My mother was inconsolable, rocking back and forth in her chair, clutching Lily's old baby blanket. My father, still weak from his stroke, just stared at the front door, waiting for it to open. I took to the internet. I wasn't a private investigator, but I was a 25-year-old who knew how to navigate the digital world. I went through every single one of Sarah's friends on social media. I looked for tagged photos, for check-ins, for anything. I found Mark's profile, the boyfriend. He had posted a cryptic status update. "Some people you just can't help. Good luck with your mess, Sarah." I messaged him. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I didn't care about being the good aunt. I was a woman looking for her kin. "Mark, this is Maya, David's sister. Sarah has disappeared with the kids. If you know where they are, please, for the love of God, tell us. We just want to know they're safe." An hour later, my phone buzzed. Mark sent a screenshot of a text Sarah had sent him that morning. It said, "They're trying to take them. They think they can win. I'm going where they can't find us. Don't follow me." He gave us the last location he knew, a small motel 3 states away. Sarah had family there, a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. She was running blind, driven by the same headache logic she'd used her whole life. When reality became too much to handle, she didn't face it, she deleted it. David and I didn't even pack bags. We got into his truck and started driving. It was a 12-hour trip, and we did it in 10. The highway was a blur of grey asphalt and red taillights. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were chasing a shadow. We arrived at the motel just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. It was a run-down place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. We saw her car parked in the back corner, tucked behind a dumpster. My heart stopped. "Call the police," I told David. "Don't go to the door. If she sees you, she might bolt again. Call the local sheriff and show them the evaluator's report. Tell them there's a risk of flight." The local police were much more helpful than the ones back home. Maybe it was the sight of two exhausted, desperate people standing in a motel parking lot at 6 a.m. Or maybe it was the risk of endangerment clause in the report. Within 20 minutes, 3 squad cars pulled into the lot. They walked to the door of room 114. We stayed back, hidden behind a pillar. I held my breath. The silence was agonizing. Then, the sound of a door being forced open. I heard Sarah's voice, a shrill, panicked scream. "You can't do this! They're my children! You're hurting me! I have a headache! I need to lie down!" And then I heard the sound that broke me. A child's voice. "Daddy? Is that Daddy?" It was Leo. The police led Sarah out in handcuffs. She looked like a ghost of herself, pale, trembling, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. She saw David and she spat on the ground. "You ruined everything," she hissed. "You and your pathetic family. I hate you." David didn't even look at her. He ran past the officers and into the room. I followed him, my legs feeling like lead. The room was a mess. Half-eaten bags of chips, piles of unwashed clothes, and the 2 children sitting on one of the double beds. Lily was crying, her face smudged with dirt. Leo was sitting next to her, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, looking like a miniature version of a soldier who had seen too much. When he saw David, he didn't move at first. He just stared. Then he saw me standing behind him. "Moon girl?" he whispered. I fell to my knees. "Yeah, Leo, it's me. It's Auntie Maya. We're here. We finally found the rocket ship." The reunion wasn't like the movies. There was no slow-motion running, no swelling music. There was just a lot of shaking, a lot of tears, and the smell of stale motel air. We held those children like they were made of glass. Lily clung to David's neck, her small sobs echoing in the quiet room. Leo just held onto my hand, his grip so tight his knuckles were white. "I kept the rabbit safe," Lily whispered into David's ear. "I know, baby," David said, his voice thick with tears. "I know." The drive back was the longest 10 hours of my life. The kids slept most of the way, exhausted by the trauma of the last few days. David drove with one hand on the wheel and the other reaching back to touch Leo's knee, as if he needed to constantly remind himself they were actually there. When we pulled into our driveway, the sun was setting. My mother and father were waiting on the porch. My father was standing up, actually standing, leaning heavily on his walker, his eyes fixed on the truck. As the kids got out, my mother let out a sound that I can only describe as a soul-deep wail of relief. She fell to her knees in the grass, and the children ran to her. For the first time in 4 years, the village was whole again. But the healing was just beginning. You don't just get over 4 years of alienation and a kidnapping. The kids were jumpy. They had nightmares. Lily would panic if Sarah wasn't mentioned in a nice way, and Leo would go silent for hours, staring out the window as if he expected a patrol car to pull up and take them away again. The final court hearing was a formality. Given the flight risk and the kidnapping attempt, Sarah was stripped of primary custody. She was granted supervised visits only, once a week, in a secure facility. The headaches finally had a name in the legal documents. Munchausen by proxy tendencies, coupled with a personality disorder that made her unable to prioritize her children over her own ego. We went home that day, and we didn't celebrate. We didn't throw a party. We just sat in the living room together. I went to the back of my closet and I pulled out the legacy box. I sat on the floor with Leo and Lily. I opened the lid. "What's that?" Leo asked, looking at the mountain of wrapped gifts and the leather-bound journals. "This," I said, pulling out the telescope I had bought 3 years ago, "is 4 years of love that had nowhere to go. It's every birthday we missed. It's every Christmas we spent waiting for you. It's the proof that we never, ever stopped looking for you." We spent the afternoon opening gifts. The winter coat for Lily was too small, but she wore it anyway, parading around the living room with the faux fur hood up. Leo spent hours putting together the Lego sets, his tongue poking out in concentration. And then I gave him the journal. "One day, when you're older," I told him, "you're going to have questions. You're going to hear things that don't make sense. When that happens, I want you to read this. It's the truth. It's the story of how much we love you." Leo looked at the journal, then at the moon girl drawing, still pinned to the fridge. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, the shadow in his eyes seemed to lift. "I knew you were real," he said softly. "Even when Mummy said you were a dream, I knew." Life isn't perfect now. Sarah still tries to cause trouble through the supervised visits. The trauma still lingers in the way the kids flinch at loud noises. But the silence is gone. The house is full of the chaotic, beautiful noise of children growing up. There are sticky fingerprints on the glass doors again. There are plastic blocks on the floor. And every night before I go to sleep, I look out the window at the moon. I'm not the moon girl anymore. I'm just Auntie Maya. And that is the greatest title I could ever have. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have stayed a ghost for 4 years? Or would you have fought sooner? Family is the most complicated, beautiful, and sometimes the most painful thing we have. If you're going through something similar, if you're being cut out of a child's life, don't give up. Keep your own legacy box. Keep the lights on. Because children eventually grow up, and they will go looking for the truth. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever dealt with a family member who used children as weapons? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the resilience of the human heart and the power of family.